Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. I'd like to open our event by inviting all of you to continue to say hello in the chat. The names are just rolling in, the places, the greetings, the connections, the conversation's already beginning. It's very exciting, and please keep it coming and let us know where you're watching from. And we also invite you to post any questions you may have for audience Q&A at the end of our chat at any point during the program, including when you introduce yourselves. And we hope to see lots of audience questions and chat throughout the next hour. October, in case you didn't know, is National Arts and Humanities Month. And as the nation's largest funder in arts, culture, and humanities, we at Mellon are really excited to host this conversation, think together, be together, about what makes the arts and humanities so distinctive and so powerful in the context of larger conversations about climate crisis and societal crisis. I want to mention here that last week, it was very exciting to see that Maria Rosario Jackson and Shelley Lowe were nominated to lead the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, respectively. And these are our government partners in the areas that we fund. We are excited about their leadership and congratulate them both. Throughout the past year and a half, we have all experienced the interconnected and ongoing emergencies of climate change, racial injustice, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Massive forest fires have burned in the West for months. Hurricanes have flooded our southern and eastern cities. The pandemic will soon enter its second year, and race-based hatred and violence remain rife in our daily lives. Poor people and people of color in the country and in the world are disproportionately affected by these crises, living on multiple front lines. In the past few months in particular, there has also been a broader collective awakening about how real and enduring these crises are. But even as more of us turn to those realities, we can often find these crises so harrowing, so overwhelming, that it is hard to make sense of what we are seeing, feeling, and thinking. We know that addressing the challenges of this magnitude demands many different responses, from civic engagement to the development of new technologies and scientific breakthroughs, to government and business responsibilities, to ongoing work on racial justice. But as we will discuss today, I would argue that in addition to these responses, it is the arts and humanities that can help save us. By us, I mean who we fundamentally are as human beings, our humanity, our essential us in intersecting communities. And especially in times of chaos, we believe that it's the arts and humanities that can help give us the insight and the knowledge and the imagination to move through what we're living through, to give us context, connect us with those who came before us, show us imagined futures and dreamed realities, help us develop the critical thinking necessary to solve society's grand challenges, and hopefully activate us into action. As we move to conversation, I will open us with a short poem that the great artist, poet, activist, and environmental imaginer, June Jordan, she did some really incredible work reimagining Harlem with Buckminster Fuller in the 1960s that is really something to look at. The great June Jordan is who will give us our invocation with her poem, Bay Waters Rolling. Bay waters rolling. Birds glide above broken rocks. I am not alone. That is June Jordan. And so I think to understand that even in our solitude, we are not alone, and that we exist on a planet much larger than we are, and we are not alone in that context either. We have three extraordinary guests joining us today for this conversation: Mel Chin, Allison Janae Hamilton, and Emily Rabbitoe. Mel Chin is a conceptual artist whose work often depends on multidisciplinary collaborative teamwork and enlists science as a component to developing complex ideas. Among his many critically important works is Revival Field, a project that has been a pioneer in the scientific field of green remediation, and the ongoing Operation Pay Dirt, a public art project that envisions and moves towards a future free of childhood lead poisoning. In 2018, Mel Chin founded Source, which stands for Studio Sustained Operations Utilizing Resources for Culture, Communities, and the Environment, a 501c3 organization. He has won numerous awards and grants for his work, including from the New York State Council of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and has been featured in the PBS program Art of the 21st Century. Mel, we are delighted that you could join us today. Thank you. Allison Janae Hamilton is a visual artist who works in sculpture, installation, photography, and video. She creates immersive spaces using elements like plant matter and complex sounds that explore how the American landscape contributes to our idea of Americana and the social relationships to space in the face of a changing climate, particularly within the rural American South where she was born and raised. Among other accolades, Allison Janae Hamilton was a 2013-14 fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program and is a recipient of the Creative Capital Award and the Rima Hort Mann Foundation grant. She holds a PhD in American Studies from New York University and an MFA in Visual Arts from Columbia University. Allison, we are very happy to welcome you today. And our third guest, Emily Raboteau, is a novelist, essayist, memoirist, and street photographer and a professor whose work captures the intersection of race, environmental justice, parenthood, and social change. Her most recent book, Searching for Zion, was a grand prize winner of the New York Book Festival and a winner of an American Book Award. Since the publication of the 2018 IPCC report, most of her writing focuses on the climate crisis. She is a founding member of the Extinction Rebellion group, Writers Rebel. She is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, a contributing editor at Orion Magazine, and a professor of creative writing at City College of New York while working on her forthcoming book, Caution, Lessons for Survival. Welcome and thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Mel, Allison, and Emily, here I go talking over everybody, but I won't do that anymore. We are so excited to have you with us today, and I would now like to open our conversation with the first question. Many of us are familiar with the necessary roles for research, science, policy, individual practice, community practice to combat the climate crisis. What I would like to ask each of you is, what do you see as the unique role of the arts and humanities in addressing the climate crisis? And we can begin anywhere, or we could begin perhaps with Emily.
I'd be happy to start. Yeah, stakes are really high. I think the title of this panel is appropriate. Climate change as a discipline, I think, better actually described as the climate crisis, is really no longer confined to the scientific arena. I was just reading on Twitter today that there's an all-time record of 70% of Americans who are now very worried about global warming, better described as global heating. And I think this attention to language is something we are very attuned to in the humanities. In fact, the percentage of those who are very worried increased 10 points since March, according to a Yale poll. So I think people outside of the sciences are expressing complicated feelings about the climate crisis, attaching narrative and emotion to the science, and aesthetically amplifying environmental realities. I'm so excited to be here with Mel and Allison to talk about their work in landscape, because I think what they're doing and what so many artists are doing is allowing audiences a more accessible and identifiable connection to global heating and some of the other issues that you raised in the opening. So narrative really matters. I'm a writer, I'm an essayist, and so I believe, as you do, Elizabeth, as a poet, that storytelling and narrative really matter. So just getting more scientists sharing more dreadful information isn't actually going to work. You need trusted emissaries and compelling stories, and that's going to come from the arts and the humanities. So science tells you what it's likely to be or what it is. It doesn't necessarily take the next step of a moral, ethical decision of what should be done about it.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Allison, how would you build on that? What can the arts and humanities, what is their unique role?
Well, I would start by kind of dovetailing off of what Emily said regarding narrative and kind of animating this scientific set of findings where we know what the stakes are, we know where we're going. However, what I think the arts has the opportunity to do is provide the imagination and the narrative, and to bring in kind of the human story into the numbers, into the data. I love this Baldwin quote. I'm going to probably mess it up a little bit, but it's basically um, saying that the role of the artist is like the role of a lover. And if I love you, then I make you conscious of what you don't see. And I
Mm,
love that, because I think that the arts, that is one role of the arts. It's not only making us conscious of something that we might not see, but it can also remind us of things that we once knew and maybe have forgotten a bit, kind of in the slings and arrows of society in the midst of all of that. And so, coming from the background that I come from, I am used to seeing Black folks, Black women particularly, really intimately connected to the land. And, in the
mm,
climate change conversation and the kind of environmental activist conversations and circles, you don't really see, women like my aunts and my grandmother and my cousins as like the face of
mhm,
environmental activism. But growing up, I I mean, any of them could tell you what was going on with the environment because they were farmers, And so for me, revisiting these narratives from my own personal and cultural history and bringing that into the conversation on climate change and environmental justice and injustice is really important, in amending this limited narrative that I think we have had recently around the idea of climate change. I was just talking to my grandma this morning about the holidays, and I was saying, "Oh, grandma, let's go fishing one day," and she's like, "Let's go 2, 3, 4 days," And so that's what I'm used to. I'm
mhm.
used to this investment in this relationship to the land, in my elders and in my community, that it's really absent from our conversations in a way that I think the arts can fill in, or at least I try to fill in my own work.
And I have so many things to ask you coming out of that, but just one thing, which is uh, what comes to mind immediately about observations of your elders about changes in the land over the time that they have lived on it?
I mean, it would be my most immediate answer to that would be the intersections of policy and climate, and also disability justice. I mean, it's almost impossible to extract one from the other because they are just so intertwined. The way that land was organized literally from the antebellum period impacts today the contemporary experience
Hmm.
of the aftermath of hurricanes, for example, or that's my kind of Gulf family, or in Tennessee, land loss and policy around Black farmers. And so it's really, to me, it's kind of a double-sided story where you have policy on one end, and then you have the natural environment on the other. And nature is going to do what it's going to do, but what are
Hmm.
we doing on the kind of the human side of things, the policy side of things, that creates human made disasters that are part and parcel with these natural disasters that are only getting more and more frequent, stronger, intense, longer seasons, all of that, coming from hurricane state and that type of background. And so, what I'm watching both on the side of the natural environment and then on the side of the human, uh, uh, affected environment, it's really kind of crashing together.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you so much, Mel. How would you enter this question?
Well, first of all, I'll go back to Mr. Baldwin since you mentioned him, where he talked about the purpose of art is to extract or find the question that is buried within the answers. I truly believe that's a profound way of looking at things. And absolutely, I don't think that um, how the arts are framed, or anybody can save humanity. I'm going to start there because the record of extinctions, the human record has been terrible, and I don't expect it to change. However, in the destructive practice that I have to include myself in, I also see it as destruction is such a boring kind of reality. It's a dreadful sameness. And I look to scholars like Elaine Scarry, who talks about pain and imagination. The propensity for pain is final incarnation, which is war, torture, or destructive practice, is the eradication of language, the eradication of ideas. And how imagination is the inverse, how that is the remaking of the world. So I kind of see, try to look at it realistically, that there's going to be this propensity for the constant unmaking of the world. And perhaps it is the job of the artist to be part of the remaking and to provoke the possibility, maybe there's salvation, but maybe even preservation. I listened to sometime my friend Dr. Paul Farmer, who talks about losing. We're losing. And maybe what we're doing is to slow down the loss so we can have those moments to grasp what our humanity could possibly be. And maybe, therefore, it's more to think about our actions a way of sowing the seeds of possibilities of some kind of continuum. And I think that it's all those things. So I like it also that you mentioned that the poem, I am not alone, I'm not alone. I think that's a lesson for an artist because we're taught to be solo players and full of our egomaniacal purposes. And in truth, we have to be part of something. It's a great opportunity in our time to be part of humanity and the investigations and research with scientists to propel scientists as well as the dreams of scientists, not only our own, and to put ourselves in different positions. You see? So anyway, it's a hell of a note that we're involved with.
And what do you think are some projects that you all find interesting, some ideas that you find interesting of people working with their varying skills together in order to think through this problem? The scientist with the artist, the poet with the community organizer, or any number of other combinations of trainings and talents.
If I may begin answering that question first, one person I've been really inspired by, I want to name check because I believe she's in the audience tonight, is the director of the Climate Museum. Her name is Miranda Massey. And, she's an activist who really understands, I think, the topic at hand tonight, which is that art in particular has the power to move the needle on climate engagement. So she, started a climate museum. She was in law and she left that profession out of, she had a vision that she needed to make space for artists to express in the ways that they were moved to express grief, hope, despair, all of the emotions in their way. And she has explained to me that art has power to move the needle for a couple of reasons. It reaches us physically and emotionally and communally where we really live. And climate change can seem really abstract, even in the midst of a hurricane. So to fully confront the immense challenge posed by the crisis, we need a visceral sense of reality. We need to be able to experience the full range of emotions that art evokes, including awe and grief and surprise and fury and tenderness and rage. I'm so glad you started with June Jordan, and Allison, I'm so glad you followed up with James Baldwin, just like Mel. I think that quote is really important, and it reminded me of another wonderful quote by the writer Toni Cade Bambara. The role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps we, most of all, we won't really make progress without each other, and art builds community. And as Miranda Massey has said, she uses this phrase a lot, and I think it's really important. Art builds a soft pathway into climate dialogue that lifts climate out of perceived polarization, stigma, despair, etc., allowing us to break climate silence, which is a wide gap between the percent of us who are worried about the climate crisis and the percent of us who speak about it or give voice to that concern. And all of this production, I think, is are drops in the bucket toward vocalizing, what I think we hope will be an articulation that will move politicians toward policy. So yeah, I'm very moved by Miranda's understanding, almost a spiritual understanding that it's important to make space for artists to express what they have to say. And I've been very awakened by some of the art that, in particular by one artist that she gave space to, Justin Guariglia, who made a series of climate signs that were just traffic signals appearing throughout New York City that were flashing messages that really affected my limbic system. Or, if a viewer noticed them, saying things like "climate denial kills," right, just randomly appearing in parks in New York City. This is in 2018 when I think there was a seismic shift in the conversation about the language that was being used after the publication of the 2018 IPCC report, encouraging us to try to maintain at the 1.5 degree Celsius threshold to avoid catastrophe. Like, language really began to change and accelerate after that point. So yeah, I'm very grateful to Miranda for making space for artists, and I've tried to preserve. Mel talked about this too, like preserve where I can and document where I can art that I see as an art critic and an essayist appearing in the streets of New York before it disappears, and just out of fascination with how artists are responding in their ways on the street to the crisis.
Mel?
It's great to be in the street. You got to be in the street. I think the inspiration could be even the civil rights movement. And I want to say that is that it's the actions, it's the willingness to take actions that are down the line, so important. And another thing that is an observation, that while we become more conscious as individuals and as creatives, the world is basically been brought to where it is by coercion within business, military, and business practices. And to be aware of that. And sometimes in the past, and I continue to advocate, I can't tell you, or I'd have to kill myself, because to advocate covert actions, in other words, applying the same methodologies to advance ideas may be just equally important. And it's not about easily recognizable situations. In other words, to fight climate change is so vast. It may be a job description to create climates. So even an idea or that message, that signboard, could be appreciated. It is to create a climate of where injustice can be finally observed. I was reading a little note about Wendell Berry was talking about the avoidance of the history of white supremacy. Maybe looking not against white supremacy, but look at what that avoidance behavior is comprised of, to create a condition where that avoidance can be dealt with. You see, so it's like working together to work on these things at a more conceptual level, and then more importantly, an activist level, taking the models of those who have really made a difference and be willing to step out of the calculated role or the perceived roles that we've created for ourselves as artists, you see. And then maybe we can be like spies and create a condition together, the four of us, you know. You know what I'm saying. But
We
don't
must.
tell anybody.
No one will know. And
Yeah,
Mel,
forget about it.
can you say more? What does white supremacy have to do with climate change? Can you spell that out a little bit?
Oh, well, absolutely. Any kind of pervasive denial of the rights of others, it means that you're absolutely affecting. You can't. You know, it goes part with all the denials that are all around. So if you're basically you're not facing truth and history.
Mm-hmm.
So how could you face
Mm-hmm.
something that's being brought before you? You'll see some of the deniers of climate change can be part of this mix. You see,
Mm-hmm.
and so therefore you have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Even now with our Source Studio, we're working in the city of Houston in the Fifth Ward. I was originally raised in the Fifth Ward. You know, Beyonce's from Third Ward. I'm from Fifth Ward, and I'm back in the neighborhoods because we're advancing this idea that maybe the solutions must come from the neighborhoods, not from these corporations that continue to operate on a stealth level with their increasing production in the face of it, while paying for the advertisements that say you should be more responsible while they continue to do what they do. That maybe those solutions can be activated within the neighborhoods that have suffered the most environmental racism, the most devastation because of economics, the ones that get the hardest blows from the hurricanes that come in, and to go back and start listening again, and then working with people within the neighborhoods to advance maybe possibilities that have not been considered. So to look at where things are coming from again, you see, to upset the conditions. So you bring maybe sciences in to complement a pre-existing understanding, as Allison has pointed out.
And I'm just thinking also, you're taking me many places that perhaps all dominion has an endpoint. We just don't always know what it is, but that it's foolish to think that extractive dominion can last forever. And maybe the fundamental place we understand that is with children, right? You know, there are cycles to these things. I don't believe that any dominion can last forever, and some of it has a much shorter timeline than it seems to realize. Allison, your thoughts?
You know, listening to Emily and Mel, especially, you know, as Mel touched on community, and oftentimes, you know, as artists, we're in our studios, we're working on our project, we're doing our thing, working with our ideas, with our little bulletin board of notes, sticky notes, and what have you. But I think the pandemic has really, if anything, has really keyed us in even more to the idea of the collective and the idea of community, and particularly as artists and culture makers and thinkers. And one thing that I've been turning toward a lot in the last 18 or so months is really the work of Black feminist thinkers and writers around ideas of not only communities of care, but joy and pleasure in this activist work. I love the quote that you brought in, Emily, you know, because this is daunting work, right? And we have a lot of work to do. It's good work. But it is work, and in order to sustain, and in order to kind of be in this for the long haul, for this marathon, we do need each other. You know, we do need to remind ourselves, as June Jordan said, that we're not alone, and that we are continuously leaning on the efforts of those who were before. And so for me, whether it's, you know, Audre Lorde and her ideas of pleasure and power, or in the contemporary sense, Joan Morgan, Brittany Cooper, these politics of pleasure and joy and communities of care as activist work, as work that is part and parcel, that is hand in hand with these direct actions that also have to be done. Because I think that as artists, as writers, musicians, visual artists, I think it's time that we kind of build upon each other's ideas in a more collective um, uh, sense, particularly on these issues that we're discussing today. I think these uniquely really necessitate a collective effort at this point in time, and I think that's one thing that I again, going back to imagination and the arts, and the collaborative spirit that is possible. I think that's something that even within the kind of day-to-day routines of our work, right? Not only the work that we're doing externally, but even internally in terms of our own lived experience and day-to-day realities as art workers. I think that's something to keep in mind. At least that's something that I'm trying to keep in mind these days.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've been talking so much about, we've been talking about all of the arts, but about the power of language, narrative, naming in particular. And so I would love to ask all of you to talk about abstraction, about more abstract spaces, or of visual and lived in spaces that that don't necessarily have language as a driving part of them, either in your own practice or in something that you see that interests you, or just as an idea. When we are without language, how do we address these issues?
I mean, for me,
Okay.
I'll speak on the land is really where I always go to first and foremost. So using sound, using kind of an immersive environment or an immersive emotional quality, to me, it really, I think you're exactly right. There are some places that words just fail us, right? And there's an emotional resonance to this. And so for me, I have one artwork, a kind of an immersive film installation called Wasisa, and basically I drug a camera down through the bottom of one of our rivers in my hometown region in northern Florida, and along the Wasisa River in and out of the Slave Canal, which is called that because it was dug out by the labor of enslaved folks to bring cotton from Georgia through the Panhandle to the Gulf. Where I'm from, it's just like a 15-minute drive from the Georgia border, so it's like that narrow little strip at the very top of the state. And so there's a little canal that was meant to go through. And we had just had Hurricane Michael come and devastate our area, known as the Forgotten Coast. And so you had these trees that were had fallen into the bank of the river. And so the images are at the top of the screen, but you have trees that have fallen, but they're at the top. And so it's really disorienting to the viewer. And I really, wanted to pull the viewer in almost this drowning experience. And through kind of the images of the whirring kind of sky and water and the sounds of the rushing water, you kind of begin to pick up on that emotional affect and this resonance of a drowning yet maybe flying type of feeling. So for me, a lot of that, I try to accomplish that with really digging into just the materials, the actual material qualities of the landscape, and allowing those to speak in those places and moments where I wouldn't be able to. I mean, I'm not a writer, but where I wouldn't be able to articulate it with words, I try to do that with the imagery and just the evidence and the material of the land that I feel like has served as a witness. So trying to imagine what would it look and feel like for that land to speak on its own, almost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Allison, I really enjoy hearing you talk about your practice. In answer to the same question that you asked Elizabeth about, what can you do beyond language when approaching this subject? I'm a writer, so I traffic in words, and yet I find that I have been employing photography in my work a lot more, or just it's not something I used to do. And now I find there are spaces, you know, like gaps or white spaces where I need to use an image to say something that I couldn't say with words. And often those are images of murals that are appearing in my local habitat, which happens to be Upper Manhattan, where I live and teach with my children. And I, you know, I used to be a travel writer. I used to have a feeling of falling in love and being really awake to the world when I was elsewhere. And then that changed in the first place because I had children and became more rooted. And in the second place, because of the global pandemic. And in both cases, I had to turn that kind of traveler's gaze, which I would describe as one of being like a love and more awake, to what's in front of me, to my local habitat, and really saw, my gosh, there are these acts of resistance that are happening in murals in my neighborhood. For example, these beautiful murals of birds that are endangered and expected to become extinct because of the climate crisis are appearing all over Harlem and northern Manhattan as an act of kind of like a memorial, sponsored by the Audubon Society, in partnership with local businesses and artists, many of whom are local, who choose the birds that speak to them and then paint them on the storefront gates of mom and pop shops and businesses such as, you know, pharmacies and shoe repairs, right? So you see these birds that come out often at night when people pull down, like the shop closes and they pull down the security gate. And there suddenly is this, you know, roseate spoonbill who is endangered. And then when you look at where this is appearing, right, in neighborhoods plagued by environmental injustice, higher rates of asthma, the migrations having to do with gentrification, there's this like doubling of crises and issues that I feel compelled to write about as an artist, but would be as a writer, but would be remiss not to include visual imagery. So it's an act of documenting and also giving space to visuals that are grieving in ways that I don't even know how to articulate with words.
Sometimes,
and I'm thinking also, please go ahead, please.
Well, sometimes, you know, you mentioned abstract. It's an interesting question about abstraction, and sometimes, you know, you go to help. Like I went to New Orleans after Katrina to help, and I was stunned and found I was inadequate. And having a lifetime as a conceptual artist to say, and it wasn't the destruction, it was more the listening to people who have gone through it. It was a sociological and psychological destruction that really stunned me and made me feel woefully unprepared to offer any assistance whatsoever. But driven by that inadequacy, that was not good enough. I went back to science and did research and tried to find doctors or researchers in the city of New Orleans and the rest of the country, and found that before the storm, 30 to 50% of the inner city childhood population were poisoned with lead before the storm. And there was no money to deal with that. While everybody was talking about all the money that's going to come in to rebuild this amazing city. And so here's the abstraction. You know, what's abstract to people of poverty or people who are being endangered by an invisible threat, especially children? Well, the abstraction was money. So that's where the Fundred project, it was pay dirt, but now it's Fundred. And I thought that perhaps what if they talked about all this money needed to be raised to solve the problem, because it is preventable. And not being that good at making money, I thought we could make money. So the first thing is to remove me from the equation and create a premise where children could express themselves and make their money. So now, you know, we're at 500,000 drawings that collected over 12 years. And that collection was given to the Brooklyn Museum. It's on view now. I think it's still there. We gave it because you can't sell that. But it doesn't stop with this art idea. we take this seriously. We're in Chicago now at its last phase, and to really meet with the senators and congressional leaders to discuss what those voices of 500,000 children and grandparents mean and what value do they represent. And see, so you move from a premise that's abstract, like money, you can't make it, I can't make it, but we can make it. So it's a project that moves into another realm entirely, but then how to exercise a methodology to increase its value to the point that it's not just about a show and tell of value, but how each one of those approximate a voice of concern and therefore maybe push and motivate and educate, in this case, a legislator to change policy. So you see, it's these are abstract ideas because when we're doing the Funder project, the kid does not need to know who I am. The kid needs to know that they have value against something that threatens them and that is invisible. That can come from the soil or the water or the air. And they need to know that and how to protect themselves better. And then given an opportunity, then our job is to deliver it and protect it. And so you see, it's a shape-shifting relationship of what creativity can be and your role as an artist. You don't have to be just doing your thing. Your thing can be motivated and be evolutionary. I think that's how you look at science and nature, to evolve your role in the time you have left, to be available, to turn in a dime, to find that dime or much more than a dime in order to make somebody safe, you see? Because ultimately, it can make you safer. So it's just that kind of opportunity to allow abstractions of danger and threat that you might not experience yourself to enter your life and make it a challenge to rise to the occasion, which means it's not you rising to the occasion, but create a catalytic structure for others to rise with you. You see what I'm saying? So anyway.
Totally know what you're saying. Yes. And when you're talking about these children's, both what they see, what they know, their potential solutions, I would love to talk more about generations, because I think that there's a kind of simplistic understanding that's not altogether untrue, that an older generation created the problems and now the young people have to figure out how to solve it. But I think what we've been talking about, and certainly this was in where you started us too, Allison, is that an intergenerational conversation. We can't cut ourselves off from people who aren't the same age as us. And it's not a very smart way to figure out how to get things done. So I would love to hear more about intergenerational exchange, understanding, working together, possibility.
I mean, I think it starts with listening, something that Mel said early on in the conversation. I spent most of the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, down in my hometown. But before that, I was here in New York City during the Democratic primary season. And when it was almost time for the South Carolina primary, many of my fellow progressive colleagues and friends and comrades were saying something to the effect of, oh, those are low information voters, right? And I'm like, low information voters? They might not be voting en masse for my candidate of choice, but they're certainly not low information voters, right? And so fast forward to the general election and beyond, to the Georgia runoff, and now I'm down in my hometown, right up by the Georgia border, kind of like here in Manhattan. It's like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. It's kind of all one area. That's kind of how we are. It's North Florida, South Georgia. So we're getting all the ads and all the Senate, so it's pretty intense. So, and then once Warnock and Ossoff won, then it's, oh, thank you, Black women. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Stacey Abrams. Thank you, Latasha Brown. And like, yes, thank them. Thank them. You should be thanking them. But what happened a few months ago when that same demographic was the low information voter, right? And so my response to that was I was working on a show at the time, and my response to that was to put mid-age, Black women prominently in the photographic environmental portraits that I was doing. And I had previously done a lot of masks, and I decided rather than to do masks to just do like small sunglasses, because I wanted you to see who this image, who this persona was that I wanted to put at the forefront of the work. I thought that, these Black women constituents should be at the front, with the microphone, not, a few months ago they're low information voters and now we're going to rely on them to save us for the Senate, and so that push and pull and that register, that really kind of ticked me off a little, so I, just that idea of not listening. I come from a culture where you sit at your elders' feet, you listen, you hear them, and again, going back to climate. I mean, I just shot a film project down in the rural areas, kind of in northern Florida, kind of the coastal Big Bend area, and we were having, we were bringing in some of the community members to kind of be sort of extras in the film, and I mean, we were just having the most intense, kind of deep conversations about climate change and climate. And I'm like, these, the mainstream kind of environmentalist climate activists completely dismiss, these group of people. I said on one panel about climate change a couple years back, and one of the questions was, well, how do we get people in the South and people in flyover America to understand the importance of, these environmental issues? And I'm like, the sustainability practices that people are engaging in daily and employing in the rural communities of this country are phenomenal in many, many ways. And we kind of on the coast, we who are kind of in these intellectual and activist circles and artistic circles, could really do well to learn from how people live and understand their own environment and understand their own changing environment in the face of climate change. People are, so I think the first step is just dismissing and throwing away this idea of a low information population in the areas that are not kind of the more elite areas of the country. Because believe it or not, folks really care about the environment in places that, we would assume, or, that we would, the larger conversation around climate change would make us assume that they don't. And I just think that an exchange and a better dialogue would really kick off a lot of interesting practice. A lot of potential is just right there in local communities that I think, I just think that all is needed is more resources in those areas, more funding, more money to do the work that is already being done and already being acted upon in many, many, many smaller areas and kind of micro climates and regions around the United States.
Well, another project we're doing in Houston is Memory Builds the Monument. When I went down to the report, I was listening to the elders, and we learned that there was this Club Matinee, and Club Matinees was the place where all these great musicians, it was the Cotton Club of the South, and everybody was in their 80s, 90s, so that they remember going to this club, with all, you name everybody from Aretha Franklin and her father to everybody had come there. And it's been buried. And they asked me, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, we eventually created, we got a local director, and we started with a film called Memory Builds the Monument Part 1. It's the prelude, because it should be much larger stories, right? But how this relates to climate change, there's the future thinking about the frontier of the future that could be in the neighborhoods, but you don't have to put that up front. You see the whole blocks of it. So what Source was thinking about is that, okay, all right, this is cool. It's almost create an action, create something. So you can build, more importantly, trust. So you could be trusted as a creative within a community you enter. You inform them first, but you listen to needs that exist within that community, and you act on that and put aside this great dream that, okay, Mel, you believe in science and all this climate change coming out of the neighborhood, but listen to us. So that's what I had to learn, that we can shift again and say, you're right, man, this is the greatest. To Little Richard, to Ray Charles met his wife there. All this stuff happened at the matinee, and it's buried in history. So let's start making that film and show it in the neighborhood, and show respect to it first, and then start there, and then you say, oh, by the way, we have done. Let's go to the next level of conversation. I may learn something else. So it is, again, this evolutionary approach to working in the communities. And, obviously, a person of my generation, I apologize to all you young people, y'all 4 of you, or 3 of you. I'm sorry. Our generation thought we were going to change the world in the 60s. We did a miserable thing. But look, I'm still trying, okay? I'm just saying.
I said it wasn't true.
Oh, I know.
I know. We're playing. We're playing.
It's all goodness.
Emily.
On topic of listening and elders and generations, I'm reminded hearing what Allison and Mel have just shared of piece of writing that I really love, I think a seminal essay by climate personal essayist named Mary Anais Heglar. It's called "Climate Change Isn't the First Existential Threat." Climate change isn't the first existential threat, which is a very important intervention to state in climate dialogue that presumes this is the first existential threat, because that wipes away the histories of those of us with African ancestry, right, who have so many lessons for us about survival and endurance, as well as Native populations, right? The writer Wopshikik Rice, First Nations writer from Canada, who says, we've already survived the apocalypse. When you think about generations, or certain generations screwing things up for the young, let's also think about the elders and the generations that can teach us lessons in survival. I was asked to review 2 books about sea level rise for the New York Review of Books, and learned quite a bit from both of those texts about managed retreat, which is a policy, something I think we'll be learning a lot more about, those of us who live on the coast. I'm here in New York. As the sea continues to rise, people are going to have to move. People are already moving. People in Staten Island, for example, post Sandy, in certain parts of that space, chose collectively, communally, to make a bid for federal funding, like to take money, not to rebuild their houses, as some people did, but rather to retreat inward, like into a safer realm on the island. And so managed retreat, when I was reading about it, made me think of my Black grandmother from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, who, in the wake of her husband's murder by a white man who was never prosecuted in 1943, when she was pregnant with my father, decided with spiritual strength, and because there were her people, were already making this passage, when something is threatening your livelihood, the life of your children, your survival, what you do is you retreat, right? You do it in community. And she followed the path of the Great Migration from Mississippi to Michigan, as many others had. And so when I wrote that book review, I opened with her story, because I wanted, as Allison has been saying, to intervene what can feel like a very a conversation that can feel very co-opted. The space can feel very taken over by white men. And so I think I just want to amplify what Allison said by kind of the intervention of putting Black women at the forefront of the conversation about survival, um, in a time of intersecting crises that are existential is really crucial, because this isn't the first
Mhm.
this isn't the first time, right?
Mhm.
So not only we have to, like, when we're thinking about generations, I think it's an accident to blame purely. I mean, let's put the blame where it lies, but also let's take the lessons. And not only from those of us who are lucky enough to have ancestors who have a lot to teach us about survival, but also from humanities texts, from great texts, spiritual texts, right? Like the writer Royce Granton, who's also a war veteran, has talked a lot in his work about pointing out the slowness of disaster. Um, there's not some future apocalypse, but rather our present reality. And that reality is a world's end that we can look to culturally endure, with lessons from Gilgamesh and the Aeneid
Mhm.
and the Torah and the Crow. Um, this is a new moment, but it's also not new.
Mhm. Mhm. We have so many things happening in the chat, so I'm going to put some questions out there for you, and we will zoom through as many as we can with all of this beauty and power and insight and wisdom that you all are sharing. From Catherine Morris, who I think might be in New York City, could Allison speak to the link she sees between climate justice and disability politics?
Mm. Thank you, Catherine. That is something that I've really been thinking a lot about within this last year in general, as it touches my life personally, coming from, again, a hurricane state, and going through this pandemic where all of my loved ones, including myself, have pre-existing, health concerns, conditions. Hurricane Ida that just, impacted Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. When you have a disability, it is hard. It's hard to evacuate a lot of times. It is hard to get out, and it is
Mhm.
hard to get back in, to get back to your house, to get resources, to board up your windows. It is, the culture that we are in is not sustainable for where we are going in terms of climate. When I was growing up in Florida, this is anecdotal, but having a category 4 was like a big deal, and now we're getting 4s and 5s, and one worry that I have is rural folks, Black folks, lower income earners, and disabled folks with disabilities and chronic illness, in the face of these rising natural disasters and intensifying natural disasters. Trying to get a friend of mine out of, figuring out how to get them out of New Orleans, as Ida was approaching. It is tough, and so being someone who lives with chronic illness, being someone who has loved ones, with the pandemic, it's just, there is a connection that cannot be divorced from race, from gender, from sexuality. It is not easy for everyone doesn't have access to the same levels of care in the aftermath of these disasters. And so it's really, I hope that the conversation begins to fold in these this really important intersection of ability with environmental justice, because you can't strip it away from race, you can't strip it away from gender. And so, we have states that are passing laws that it's okay to deny someone who is trans or non-binary healthcare. What does that look like in relationship to natural disaster, in relationship to emergency care, in relationship to this growing and intensifying climate crisis? So, I think that is one area that I would just like to see more conversations about. And, I plan to do what I can to keep learning and keep amplifying that. But for me, it just has a, my immediate thought on that, to answer the question in particularity, is specifically with hurricanes, flooding, and that sort of thing. But really, you could just see it across different types of natural disasters and climate concerns.
Thank you. This question from Lori Hamrick. Can we address the connectivity between emotion, mental health, and the arts with regard to our topic today? So opening up the space to talk about emotion and mental health. Yes.
I could tell a story about Flint.
Tell a story.
Okay, well, this is a story. What an artist can do sometimes is also the third factor is connectivity. That's an action. So I had this idea for Flint because they had all the lead crisis there, and they're having to drink out of plastic bottles. So I said, why don't we collect those plastic bottles and turn them into fabric and take it to a designer like Tracy Reese in New York and design rainwear and swimwear and create some economy for the people there. Because that's a thing. Because rather than just addressing the lead and the pipes, which I could not do as an artist or as an art project, how do you create a condition of hope? So I go there, but you can't just come up with projects and throw down and say, this is what we're going to do. I went there and said, before we do anything, I want to talk to you. So we gathered all these people from different neighborhoods of Flint, and they were there. And this is what they told me. They said, okay, all right, Hillary's been here, Trump's been here, Janae Monáe has been here. They've all been here, and we're still drinking the damn lead water. What the hell do you think you're going to do? If you want to make your art, go ahead and make your art. But, we're not going to stand in your way. But, what are you going to do? And I presented this thing, well, I've got all these parts, but we don't have to do a damn thing until you say so, you see? And it was one of the projects that I have to say that you create these connectivity. I don't know if this answers the question, but I'm saying you can apply all those things, and they can be, maybe you're not applying the solution individually. You create connections that apply a direction that's possible. And sure enough, they got the bottles, we did the whole thing, and brought them to the show in New York. And after I'm gone and forgotten, Tracy is working with that neighborhood and those people making fashion clothes right now to this day, giving them the employment they deserve, right? So it's not always the outcome of one massive issue, but it's how you can connect things because you have the flexibility as an artist. Maybe that's what I'm saying. The movement that is essential. Even at my advanced age, I gotta move. You gotta do it. And that's the story.
Thank you.
I can answer
Emily,
that
Allison,
same question.
Please.
From the perspective of being a professor in the humanities, I teach creative writing within an English department at a public university in New York City. That's the City University of New York. And, since I became awakened by the art of others via the Climate Museum to the urgency of the climate crisis, I felt that I really needed to make a space in my classroom as an educator, in the privileged position of being an educator, to teach about, talk about, read about, and also make space for feelings of grief surrounding this crisis. So some of my students are, Generation Z at this stage where they're really questioning whether or not they want to bring children into this world. I mean, that's real. And not to make space for grief and all the other emotions that I talked about in the beginning, but grief is a really big one of them. Within the space of the classroom, without naming the elephant in the room as being the elephant, I'd feel like I was failing as an educator. So I just want to say I think it's really important to make space for the reality, to educate about the reality, but also to make space for the emotions attached to it. And I happen to teach in a subject where that's allowed, right? In creative writing, there's space for that in their poetry, in their fiction, in their personal essays. And I also encourage them to read the science, yeah, that's what I'll say about emotion.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question. Our time is flying, that we could do a quick round robin to answer. And this is from Michelle Lanier, who identifies as a folklorist from Afro Carolina. And the question is, I'll read it in its fullness. I am so pleased to be present for this embrace of our transforming ecosystem in the arms of artistry. Thank you. Could you share any personal or communal practices you use to reconnect with the environments most resonant to you? And if everyone could give a quick answer to that, that would be great.
For me, I just go out in nature, kayaking, hiking, all the time when I'm home. That's what I do.
I'm trying to teach my children the names of plants so that they're not plant illiterate.
And are you doing that in Uptown and in the Bronx? Because I also think what your piece on the birds reminds us of is that there's nature, but then there's also, we are on the earth when we're in the city too. So does that plant work happen? Yeah.
Yeah, I
Do
mean,
you do
I
that
think
on city walks?
On city walks, yeah. I think it's really important for kids in cities to be taught the names of plants and to understand that they're part of the fabric of the air that we breathe and that we're interconnected, right? To understand pollination and food justice and all of that. They need to know the names of the trees in order to care about them and understand the ways that those trees are helping us breathe. And if they were cut down, it would be bad for us, and that we need more of them, I think is really crucial.
I like to take that walk with you, Emma, and learn something about that nature.
Let's do it.
I think I'm trying to learn about my nature. I think it's fundamentally critical, and to know how flawed you are. And in order to get down to what it is that might be bugging somebody that you don't understand, because it's where their misunderstanding or their histories may be deeper and less superficial. In an age of polarization, things will get so mediated, and so maybe you're not free of it. And so this is the thing, to get over myself, you see, is key. Or I can't do anything for anybody else.
Well, thank you all from our collective hearts. There's so much more to talk about, and I want to thank everybody who came to listen to this program. The conversation that you're having, the questions that you're putting out there. Thank you for the resources that you're putting out. I think that for every time something was referenced, somebody put a link to it up in the chat, as well as other things that people are doing and thinking about and involved with and admiring of. So really, really profound thanks for this extraordinary conversation. And I want to close us before we say goodnight with another poem. There were so many. My happy rabbit hole today was reading and finding so many different poems that could surround our topic. But it won't surprise you that I chose the poet Ross Gay. And this is his poem, A Small Needful Fact. A Small Needful Fact by Ross Gay is that Eric Garner worked for some time at the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow. Continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. So thank you, friends. Thank you, friends invisible, and we will keep talking to each other. Thank you.